evening. Good to be with you again this evening. If you have a Bible, go ahead and be turning to the book of James. James chapter 4. James chapter 4, and we'll pick up in verse 13 here in just a moment. This is a series we've been going at for a little bit now, and I know it's been a few weeks since we've gotten into this series. Maybe some of you have thought I've forgotten about it. I'm sure you haven't. Been working on some other things as well, and thinking about what's next after we finish James. We are getting close to finishing James, finishing out chapter 4 this evening. And we've covered a lot so far, rather James has covered a lot so far, in even just this small book. We've looked at the themes of testing faith, doing the word, not just hearing the word, but actually doing it. In chapter 2, the idea of someone who is partial to others and expecting to still be tied to God. Those things just don't mesh together. That's double-mindedness, James says throughout. The idea of faith and works, how both of those things work in harmony with one another, and they can't be separated. The taming of the tongue, in the last lesson, the humbling of ourselves before God. And one of the things that we could point out, or point to in several places throughout James, is this idea, this comparison between pride and humility. And we looked at that again last time. And so in this next section, verses 13 through 17, which we'll come to here in a second, one of the things, or one of the main points that is often drawn from this little section is the idea of making plans. And some would even go so far into say that you don't need to make any plans. You just need to leave everything up to chance, and God's just going to take care of everything. You don't put in any effort. Just throw caution to the wind and do what you're going to do. God's going to take care of things. That's not what we see in this passage, and we'll figure those things out and go through those things. But as James has already done in talking about specific attitudes of individuals, we have the man of partiality, the one who is hypocritical, the one who has a loose tongue, does not control the tongue, the worldly person, and some of those things are going to even be in these verses. He's now going to talk about, if we just had to boil it down to one characteristic, a prideful person, one who is all about self and thinks of no others, all thinking about self. So let's go ahead and read the text, and then we'll begin to draw some points here. So this is James chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast, and in your arrogance, all such boasting is evil. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. So the first major point that I'd like for us to look at, and I believe that James brings out here, is that disciples aren't worldly. And this goes back even to what we read, or what we covered last time in verse 4. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of God, or a friend of the world, makes himself an enemy of God. So the world and the prince of it are constantly trying to turn us towards just the default behavior of the world. wants us to conform to the world, as we talked about in class this morning. just to go along with the crowd and do what everyone else is doing, because after all, that's the easiest option, isn't it? Everyone else is doing it, so it is incredibly easy. So instead of looking outward, looking at the world and seeing what we can do to look right in the world's eyes, what James has already said is that you need to be looking at a different source. The world is not the standard for that. We look, and we saw this in chapter 1, James chapter 1, we need to be looking at this source, the perfect law of liberty. We look into it like a mirror, and it's supposed to change us, to change our behavior, and to change entirely who we are. So we need to let the Word change us from the inside rather than Satan and rather than the agents of Satan. Furthermore, in just a brief point here, you cannot have two kings. Of course, Jesus makes the point in Matthew 6 and verse 24, you cannot serve two masters, for you will love one and hate the other. You cannot serve God and money, or mammon, as the King James says. But there in Matthew 20:16, and even really the entirety of John 13, we see this idea of the last being first and the first being last. The idea of one who serves, one who maybe is even in a position of power, as Jesus was in John 13. What does he do? He washes the disciples' feet. And the point there is that you must be humble. And not just that you must be humble, but you cannot expect to serve self, okay, while also serving God. Those things don't go together. You have to pick one. There is always a choice. And then one showing of pride amongst these Christians, one evident showing of pride amongst these Christians, was not only their scheming, their planning, but their arrogant scheming and planning, because it was apart from God. And don't you know, this is a major problem in our country, right? The idea of, and it's always been this way, from the country's inception, one who pulls themselves up by their bootstraps, a self-made man, freedom and independence, and all of these things, the land of opportunity. The idea that you can be whatever you want to be so long as you put in the work and you do all of the things. And you're the one who then has all of those things at the end of the gravy train there. The focus is so much on the physical, and it's entirely not on the spiritual. One of the things that, or several of the things that Abby and I saw when we were there in London, there at the British Museum, there is just king after king after king after king who has made a monument, not to some god, but to himself, because he thinks he's a god. And it would be phrases like, I am powerful, I am important, look at these campaigns that I've been involved in, and all these nations that I've conquered. You remember what Nebuchadnezzar said there in the book of Daniel, look at this great Babylon that I have built. That's the kind of phrases that you see from ones in great positions of power. But it doesn't even have to be someone in a position of power. It can be in our own circles as well. James uses the phrase here, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. How is it evil? How does that happen? How can we avoid it? Those are the types of questions that we want to answer this evening, and that James does answer for us here in the text. The idea of living in the world but not being of the world. You've heard that phrase before, I'm sure. And those things can be reconciled, and we have to reconcile them as Christians. So, moving on here, disciples, as I've already alluded to, do not boast. But it's not that they don't boast, it's that they don't boast in certain things. They do boast in other things, and we'll get to that. But the first point here, that boasting and arrogance have been around for a long, long time. And I'm sure that we could all come, if we went around the room and everyone just named an example from the Bible about someone who was arrogant or boastful, especially in themselves. They thought a lot of themselves. We could name a different one for every individual, and just some ones that come to my mind: Adam and Eve, and the Tower of Babel there in Genesis chapter 11, where they were trying to make themselves equal with God in so many ways. Israel, throughout their history, did this and had this attitude. It is the idea that if God can do it, then I can do it. Okay? Now, in some of those things, that needs to be our attitude. If God does it, we need to do it. But this is an entirely different attitude when someone approaches it in this way. If they're thinking about self and they're trying to puff themselves up, they see God and they see His position. And this is exactly what Eve saw in the garden, and the lie that was fed to her. God is trying to keep you from being like Him. He's trying to put you down. And Eve said, well, I want some of what God has. And in fact, I want to, in many ways, I want to become a god. And she found out, as well as Adam, that that was not the end, or that was not the goal, or the end of that goal. Paul quotes Jeremiah in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 in verse 31. And Paul says here, as Jeremiah did there in the book of Jeremiah, that there is something, or rather someone, that we can boast in, but it is God. Let him who boasts boast only in the Lord God. 1 Corinthians 1 in verse 31. One other interesting note, just talking about words here for a moment. James has already used this word in his letter. He's already used that same word boast, but he's actually used it in a positive sense. So we go back to chapter 1, and we look at verses 9 and 10. Let the lowly brother exalt in his exaltation, but the rich in his humiliation, because as a flower of the field, he will pass away. So the exaltation, the humility, or the humble state of the rich and the poor, that's the context that he had used this word originally. You go over to the book of 1 John, in 1 John chapter 2, 1 John chapter 2 and in verse 15. 1 John 2, beginning in verse 15. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. This is the only other place in the New Testament that this specific word for boast is used. The idea of pride, that sort of pride. And John's point here in this letter is that all that is in the world, including pride, the arrogance of life, as some translations say, is not from God, but it is of the world. And as James is going to talk about, and we'll cover this point here in a moment, that is not according to the will of God. It's according to the will of self. It's according to someone's will, but it's not God's. And we have to keep that in check. So instead of boasting, what does James say? You ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. And then you probably picked up on the subtlety of what James said in that phrase, that all such boasting is evil. Not just boasting is evil, but all such of this type of boasting is evil. Again, he used this word prior in chapter 2 when talking about partiality. And he equated that behavior to those with evil thoughts, evil motives. So what kind of influences are these? Are they influences for good or are they influences for evil? They are evil. They are of the world. And someone might say, well, yeah, boasting, it's not good, but, we tolerate it. That's all right. It's not that big of a deal. No, it doesn't have any place. No, it has no place in the Lord's church. A disciple cannot have this sort of attitude. And so again, one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, are we loyal to the King? And if we are, then anything that is not a part of His will is purged out. It's gone. That might have been a part of our past lives, being in the world, but it's not anymore because we are loyal to the King, not loyal to self anymore. So the idea also that's kind of bound up in this idea of boasting is planning, but not just planning, but planning for profit while ignoring the potential for good that might come from such wealth and from such effort. The section that we'll look at next time deals directly with the rich, and that's tied to these verses in 13 through 17, but moving into chapter 5, specifically talking to the rich. And what these individuals here in chapter 4 are saying is, let's go to this city and let's go to that city and we'll buy and sell and trade and do all of these things. Meanwhile, who are they neglecting? The needy and those who need it. Not only the needy, but I think we can probably even infer, and I think James means for us to infer, to call back to chapter 1 and looking at verse 27. One of the things you remember that's involved in pure and undefiled religion, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble. It may very well be that in all of their planning for self, that they neglected others in the process, and those that needed it most, more particularly. So we go over to Acts 4, and there's several places in Acts that we could go to, but in Acts chapter 4, and in verse 32, we see this very attitude of forgetting self and trying to take care of those who need it most. Now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but that they had all things in common. And with great power the apostles gave witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. And then notice verse 34. Nor was there anyone among them who lacked, for all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the proceeds of the things that were sold, and laid them at the apostles' feet, and they distributed to each as anyone had need. And we go on and read that one of those individuals was Barnabas. We read into chapter 5, and we discover that there are those with the wrong motives. Not only the wrong motives, but they lie, and there's that. They could have sold however much they wanted, Ananias and Sapphira, but in fact they lied to the apostles, and by effect they lied to God. But we see the point here. Considering others before considering self. Putting others first. Loving one another. Hasn't James already talked about that? He's quoted that from Leviticus already. They are not looking to God for their own blessings. They're looking to self-preservation, and just making more and doing more, being so short-sighted in so many ways. We'll come back to Luke chapter 12 here in a moment, talking about the rich man there. So, in all of this, what do disciples need to be doing? We've talked a lot about what disciples don't need to be doing. How do disciples face the future? What is involved in that? And the first thing that I would draw from the text here is that God, and this is a simple point, God must be the focus of all that we plan to do in life. And we see that point. We read passages like this and we say, yeah, that's right. God needs to be the focus of all that we plan to do in life. But when it comes to actually doing it, oftentimes it's a lot harder, especially if it's something that we really want, but it may not be according to God's will. And we'll continue to flesh that out as well. Maybe you noticed as well in verse 13 of James 4 here, you don't, and this is throughout the context, God is entirely absent from the conversation here. And James makes that point. He says, you ought to say, if the Lord wills. But the phrase in verse 13, today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, make a profit. God's not in the picture. He has nothing to do with these plans. So, again, James gives them a different idea of what they ought to do. And I'll just make this brief side point, and I'm sure the point has been made here before. I don't think what James is saying is that any time we make plans, we have to repeat the phrase, if the Lord wills. I don't think that's a bad phrase. I think it's fine for us to use that phrase. But to fall into the type of ritual that the Pharisees do, and even some of the Orthodox versions of Christianity today, which of course is not Christianity, but the Catholics and Greek Orthodox and so on and so forth with their catechisms, and they just repeat things over and over again because it sounds good. I don't think that's what James is talking about here. I do believe that language is appropriate, and I do believe, as is evident with James, that it's not only using that phrase, but it needs to be our attitude, right? It needs to be what's in our hearts. It needs to be what motivates us, an attitude of, again, humility. That I know, I understand my position, that I'm not in control, but God is. And so that is entirely different than I'm going to go do this. We will go and do this. We're going to make a name for ourselves, and that sort of language. I mentioned Luke chapter 12. Put a marker here in James. Let's look at this example, this parable here in Luke chapter 12. Beginning in verse 16, Luke 12, verse 16. Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. I don't always read the passage in the way that I just did, but giving emphasis on certain words there, and you notice words, pronouns that are used over and over again. I, me, and my. Your soul, speaking of himself there. God's will for man, for this man, is that he would not live to see another day because he wasn't living for the will of God to begin with. The plans that he had made for himself, he didn't even get to see the next day. He never got to finish those plans. And it was because of his foolish attitude. And I'll just make one other side point here. Just because we're a Christian and we claim Christ and we say we're a Christian does not mean that now all of a sudden anything we do gets a stamp of approval from God. Even if we say, I'm doing this in the name of the Lord, or I'm doing this for God. And you've heard that point made before, I'm sure. Jesus makes that point several times. Matthew 7, 21 through 23, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does what? The will of the Father. He is the one. We can't say, God is good, and this is kind of even a sub-point of this side point. We can't say, God is good, and it was his will in this situation for this to happen or that to happen. Maybe sometimes we throw around that phrase, the will of God, too loosely in saying, I know for certain that this was the will of God. When tragedy happens in someone's life, and I understand where they're coming from and what they're saying, they might be inclined to say, and I've said this as well, this must have been the will of God. We go over to the book of Job, and there were horrible things that happened to God. And yes, God allowed those things to happen, but who did he allow to do those things? It was Satan. I don't think we can, and I don't think we would deduce that was everything that Satan did. That was God's will, and God is watching over that situation, and Satan is the one that's driving that force. And he's the one bringing all of those horrible things against Job. So, again, just a side point, saying this was the will of God. Maybe we can be careful in using that language. But, coming back, tangent aside, anywhere that we can, I think we need to be sure that we are doing our best to stay in line with the will of God. That is, we look to this. We pray about it. We pray, maybe if it's not become clear what God's will is, that it would become clear to our dull minds, and that we can see the path that he's already laid for us, and just to make the best decision that we can. Or even maybe a certain job. We look at a certain career path that we're going to take. Maybe that's not within the will of God. A certain way of life maybe is not in line with what his revealed will says. It's not the idea of, I'm going to go ahead and make this decision. I'm going to take this job offer. I'm going to move to this city. And after I've done it, then I'm going to pray to God, I hope this is your will. Right? You hadn't been asking him beforehand. And maybe you're trying to bend the will of God during that whole process because, after all, it's not what he wants, it's what I want. This looks really good for me and my family. This looks really good for my position, for my salary, whatever it might be. But no real thought of God in that. If we know that something's wrong, God's not going to change his mind about it. His will remains the same, no matter what we want. And we have to recognize that. So we need to make plans that are really rooted in reality, in real things. And this is another point that has been well taken and well mined from the text here, that life is short. Life is like a vapor, James says here, that it's here one moment, it's gone the next. In spite of all the plans that we make in our lives, it goes by like that puff of smoke or the vapor that comes from boiling water. You use any image there that comes to mind. There's actually, and I just want to spend a few moments here going to some passages in the Old Testament that also speak to this idea. In Psalm 39, and looking at verse 4 to begin with, Psalm 39, and in verse 4, Lord, make me to know my end, and what is the measure of my days, that I may know how frail I am. Indeed, you have made my days as handbreadths, and my age is as nothing before you. Certainly every man at his best state is but a vapor. And then you go down to verse 11. When with rebukes you correct man for iniquity, you make his beauty melt away like a moth. Surely every man is vapor. I think it's the ESV and maybe even the NASB render that breath. Breath, vapor. I think the Maybe the Old King James renders that vanity. So it's empty. It's nothing. It is here 1 second, and it's gone the next. It's very, very short-lived. We go over to the prophet Isaiah. In Isaiah 38, and in verse 12, in the studies that Wes and I have been having together, we've been going through the book of Isaiah, and we recently came here through the story of Hezekiah that's kind of put in here at the last little part of the first half of the book. We get some of that history that's written down for us in the Chronicles. And this is after Hezekiah has had a run-in with death. And he has been blessed by the Lord to have his life extended for 15 years. And here in Isaiah 38 and in verse 12, he says, my lifespan, this is him talking about, thinking back on what's happened. My lifespan is gone, taken from me like a shepherd's tent. I have cut off my life like a weaver. He cuts me off from the loom. From day until night you make an end of me. I have considered until morning, like a lion, so he breaks all my bones. From day until night you make an end of me. So I want to focus on that first part there in verse 12, like a shepherd's tent. What is he talking about there? Well, you think about the life of a shepherd and what a shepherd does. He doesn't just stay in one pasture the entire time. Once that pasture is spent of resources, he moves on. So his tent has to be very easy to put up and take down. And it's probably very small as well. But it is the idea of it's here one night and then it's gone the next morning because he's moving on to the next site. And it takes very little time to put it up and to take it down. He cuts me off from the loom. The idea that comes to my mind there is, those of you who know a little bit about Greek mythology, the fates, they're often depicted as witches. The three witches, the three fates. One is the one who spins the thread, the other is the one who stretches out the thread, and then the third one is the one that cuts the thread. The thread representing the span of one's life. And when that thread is cut, the life is over. But it takes very little time to spin the thread, it takes very little time to stretch it out, and it takes very little effort to cut it. Spun the thread of life, measured the thread. And then don't you love the imagery of the lion here? A lion breaking all his bones. None of us, and Hezekiah would not have thought this as well. I fully expect when I walk out my door this morning that a lion is going to jump on me and he's going to break all my bones. None of us do that. Maybe there's some dogs in our neighborhood. We think, that's happened maybe a few times before. It's not happened. None of us expect that to happen. Hezekiah didn't expect that to happen. It is sudden, it's unexpected, and it's maybe it's even inferred here it's going to be pretty vicious death for Hezekiah. But God spared him through his grace and through his mercy. Over in the book of Hosea, in Hosea chapter 6, Hosea 6 and in verse 4, we get this phrase. This is not a vapor being described per se, something like it. Hosea 6 and in verse 4, O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? Speaking of Israel or God's people here. O Judah, what shall I do to you? For your faithfulness is like a morning cloud, and like the early dew, it goes away. So the context here, of course, is not talking about the span of one's life, but it's talking about the faithfulness of God's people. That it did not last very long. It's very wishy-washy. You go back to the days of the judges where it's, they're loyal, then they're disloyal, then they're loyal, then they're disloyal, and it's just over and over and over again. That's really the story of God's people throughout their history. And he likens it to what? He likens it to a morning cloud. And I would just note here, this is the same word for cloud that is used in the Pentateuch, in Leviticus and in Exodus and Deuteronomy, talking about the cloud of incense that would be offered in sacrifice. And so you can just imagine this billowing smoke where, yes, it's a steady stream of smoke, but it's quickly disappearing as it gets to the top. It's a puff of smoke and it's gone. Like the dew that goes away early. So you walk out on a summer morning, especially here in Alabama, and the humidity is high. The ground is really wet. It's soaked. But by the time we reach the afternoon, or even just noon, maybe even late morning, it's gone. It's not here anymore. In Proverbs, Solomon says, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth." Doesn't that language sound familiar to what James has said? Jesus says words similar, again, referencing Matthew chapter 6, in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, and in verse 34, "Do not worry about tomorrow, sufficient for the day is its own trouble." So as Christians, as God's people, we make plans, yes. We have to make plans. We live in this world. But we do so according not to our own will, but to the will of God. And not only that, but we do so with the recognition that what I have in my possession is the life that God has given me. And it may only be for today. And as long as I have today, I use it. And I use it not for myself, but I use it for God, I use it for others, I use it for their good. I'll tell you what, when I was a kid, and I'm sure any of us can relate to this, you're 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and all you can think about is becoming a teenager. It's all you want in life, because the teenagers are cool. They get to drive. They get to play on the sports teams. They get to do all the fun things. Well, then you're a teenager and like, man, I can't wait to be in college. Can't wait to go off and get rid of mom and dad and do all the things that I want to do. And then you get in college, and like, man, I can't wait to get rid of all this schoolwork and actually get a real job. And then you get a real job, and like, what was that all about? But you get a job, and maybe you're not married yet. Well, I'd love to be married one day. You're married. Well, I'd love to have kids one day. Well, Abby and I have one on the way. And, you look back, and you're like, where's the time gone? And a few years ago, I would jokingly tell people, I'm half a century, or not half a century, I'm not quite there yet, quarter of a century. And we use phrases like that, quarter of a century, half century, 3/4. God hasn't even promised us that we're going to reach a century. Be incredibly blessed if I reach that age, if any of us reach that age. But even if we did, what James says here is still true. That is even a vapor. In another lesson about hope that I preached recently, we talked about the idea of reaching heaven, being disappointed that we didn't get to go on this vacation, or get to buy this house or buy this car or be involved in whatever life has to offer. That's just not going to happen. If we're truly dedicated to God and we reach heaven, that's not going to be our attitude. Okay. But what we also noted is, if that is our attitude here, that we have to check off every last one of these things that I have plans for in my life, we're not going to dwell with God, because we don't want Him to begin with. So why would we expect to be there? Here in this life, we cannot live a life of emptiness, but rather we need to empty ourselves for God. What does that look like? Well, we've talked about some of those things already, and I'll try to move quickly through these last few points here. But the idea of walking slowly or softly, we don't have time to read this passage, but again, there in Isaiah, in the same context with Hezekiah having just run in with death, and 39:15 through 20 there. He says, "I now walk slowly. I walk softly." Why? Because this came on me like a freight train. I wasn't expecting it, so now I'm going to be extra cautious and extra careful about every step that I take and to make sure that it is faithful to God. We continue to read in that story, and we find, well, maybe he didn't do as good of a job with that as he should have, but that was at least his ambition. Maybe you've been faced with death. You know someone who's been faced with death. That would, or it should, cause you to walk in this way, to walk more slowly, cautiously, and for us to recognize that God is in control. But I'll say this as well. Someone can be in that situation. It may be that none of us ever experienced something like that. So, what is the point? It shouldn't take a near-death experience for us to learn this lesson to walk slowly, to walk softly, to watch every step that we take and to make sure that it's the right one. We need to learn that lesson now. And so when making plans, we should not neglect the responsibility we have of doing good, and not just doing good, but doing it now, making that point again. So often our plans in life, they don't really have any real purpose to them. Again, we just kind of go along with the crowd, and maybe it's even the idea, FOMO, I guess that phrase is still used, fear of missing out. The idea that if I don't do this, I'm going to be an outcast. I'm not going to be left, or I'm not going to be a part of the scene. I'm going to be left out. We have to ask ourselves, what brings us true happiness? Is it those things? Is it a career? Or is it our ambition to be a kingdom citizen? And to be a kingdom citizen here, we have to be one here to reach that eternal home in heaven. And, one question that the young people might ask themselves, is this job, is this career path, and this is really for anyone, but is this going to help or hinder my walk as a Christian? It may propel me into the business world and help me in all sorts of ways, but what's my motivation? Is it money? Is it status? Is it power? Is it rebellion? My parents don't want me to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Is it even the idea of, this is what I love to do, this is my passion, and so I'm going to do it? Okay, but if you want to have a family, you've got to think about things other than your passion, because all of a sudden, this is your passion, or it should be. Even if you don't have a family, you need to get your priorities straight. You need to be thinking about God. In coming back to James here, in verses 15 and 16, I'll make this final point. Now you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. We read that already. But even in verse 15, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. Again, it's not enough just to say that. It's not enough just to say, if the Lord wills, but I'm going to go ahead and do what I'm going to do anyway. We have to actually live that. I think there's an obvious connection between what James says about the will of God and doing good. That if you neglect to do good, you are working against the will of God. Because it's your own will, it's self-will. One final passage, I said that was the final passage in James, but one final passage over in Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3, and in verse 27, I think we'll find this language to be familiar. Proverbs 3 and verse 27, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in the power of your hand to do so. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come back, and tomorrow I will give it. when you have it with you. We've already read that in James, not in this lesson, but in chapter 3. It's not enough just to say, go be warm and be filled, but not actually do anything to accomplish that. We cannot plan for self alone. We cannot plan without God in the picture. We cannot plan without the intent of loving others and without the accomplishment of loving others. We have to live a purpose-filled life, but filled with God's purpose, not our own. Hope that lesson's been encouraging to you. If you're here this evening, perhaps you found that you've tried all the things that life has to offer, and you've been going after self in whatever way that may manifest itself. You find that that's empty, and you want something more than that. Then you can come to have a relationship that is full of meaning, that is full of purpose, and that is found in Jesus Christ. And you can begin that journey even this very evening by putting him on in baptism, starting that walk. Maybe you've walked away from Jesus. You've not been loyal to the King, but you've been loyal to other things. You can come back this evening, and he would rejoice, we would rejoice with you. If you have a need, won't you come as we stand and as we